Half a day, everyone. So happy to share space with you all as you are convening for this occasion of your conference. I'm just getting my PowerPoint situated here real quick, and then I'll get started. So as I get started, I just wanted to um, take a special moment to acknowledge Miss Hannah Middleton, who's no longer with us. She's now joined the ancestors, but she certainly has been the link for myself and a lot of the ongoing work that's happening on Guahan in resisting militarization. And so just wanted to take a special moment to acknowledge her, as well as to acknowledge the soil on which you all are standing or sitting. That is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. And I'm from the island of Guahan in the Micronesian region of the Pacific. And so I'm a little bit of a ways straight up. If you draw a line straight up from Australia, you'll probably bump into my tiny little island. And so I'll be talking a little bit about the ongoing global wars and their impacts on Chamorros of Guahan. And so, of course, Chamorros are the native or inhabitants of our island. Okay, let me figure out how to move this here. Okay, and so just to situate my positionality, this here is a map of Micronesia. And so as you can see where my island is this tiny little island right here called Guam. Most typically we are a dot on the map, literally. And to our west is the Philippines. To the north of us is Japan. And so the activities militarily that happen around Okinawa, of course, we're very connected to in terms of military triangles. And then Australia, of course, being somewhere down here. But this was a map that was developed to show the expanse of space that is Micronesia. And as you can see, it's transposed over a map of the continental United States. So, of course, in the case of the US, they're mostly land, the continental US, but with us, we're primarily water, the Pacific Ocean. And so our peoples have endured over 350 years of colonization. And if you look at the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, we are perhaps the one with the longest history of colonization among the 17 who remain formally on the globe. And so our people came and migrated to these islands a very long time ago, over 4,000 years ago, not as long as the Aboriginals, but certainly a long time ago. We've been here for roughly 4,000 years. And we've suffered different colonial hands along the way. The first of which was the Spanish, who bumped into us in the mid 1500s, came back in the mid 1600s and set up Catholic missions. And that really was the major process of colonization for our island. We remained under the Spanish crown until after the Spanish-American War in 1898, during which time we were bought by the United States for a very small sum of money. And then we remained under the US's jurisdiction until World War II for a brief 3-ish years period, during which time the Japanese Imperial Army had overtaken our island. The Americans were off of the island, and then they came back to reoccupy in 1944. And we have been a US colony since. This is just a map that shows our migration through the Pacific. And as you can see, Australia there's in the south. We are round about here. This is our island here. And so part of the migration into our region came out of the Austronesian descent from South Taiwan into the Pacific. But there's also part of that theory also suggests that the Torres Strait Islanders and PNG folks moved up this way. And so they also are part of what populated the Micronesian region of the Pacific. And so this slide here has a picture of Foha rock, which for us is a very sacred rock. And our stories tell us that it is the source of creation, that humanity was born of this rock, and it is located in the southern village of Humatek. Our story of Ponten and Fona tell us of this. Ponten and Fona are two brother-sister gods who were the co-creators of humanity. And so, as Indigenous peoples, our values are very anchored in respect and reciprocity. One key principle that governs how we interact and relate with each other is called Inafat Maulik, which refers to a collective peace and always attempting to achieve and to strive for a balance in our society in terms of engaging each other. And this, I think, is one of the things that we as peoples are able to really offer the world, particularly in terms of our conflict resolution processes. That is very contrary to what's happening, not just in the US, but really is happening at a global scale. And so this map is one that I love to show that centers Guahan here. And as you can see, these are the distances to a number of the most common sites of US military bases. You folks in Australia are here, and so we know that there's connections with Darwin in the north, as well as other parts of Australia. In the Philippines, they most recently have penned an agreement again with the United States. And then, of course, Korea has a number of bases, particularly on Jeju Island more recently, that has been developed facing China. And then Japan, with the majority of the burden of US bases in the south on Okinawa, although there are bases as well in Tokyo area and so forth in Okinawa. I'm sorry, in Japan. And then as we traverse across the ocean here, a lot of these triangles of military exercises expand to the San Diego region where there's huge military bases, and Hawaii, of course, which is oftentimes referred to as the He'e, or the head of the octopus in terms of the Pacific Command of the U.S. military, where most of most things center here. Hawaii, of course, has indigenous Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli, who are their indigenous people, but they are a 50th state of the United States, and Guam remains an unincorporated territory of the United States. And so as an unincorporated territory, it really is, we're sort of the poster child, if you will, for what empire does in terms of exploiting a people and their communities. And so in a very modern context, this list of limitations of our political status, which is an unincorporated territory of the United States, begins to kind of capture what that looks like for us. And so while we are US passport holders, we do not have the right to vote for US president. And so we have our own local elections and we elect our local leaders. We even elect a congressional representative with no true vote who's a delegate to the United States Congress. But we do not vote for the president themselves. And so this really is classic colonialism in that sense. In terms of the no true vote of our congressional delegate, what that means is they're able to participate in certain votes in the US Congress, in particular votes that are at the committee level. Depending on who controls Congress, that determines whether or not territories participate. And so when it's a Republican Congress, then we typically have no voting rights at all. But if it's a Democratic one, then they will give us the right to vote in committee. However, this concept of a no true vote, what that essentially means is whenever there's a tie, and so our vote essentially is the tiebreaker, then our vote gets canceled. It becomes null. In addition to that, many people believe that because we're U.S. territory, you must receive a lot of federal funding and the U.S. takes care of you. And so you're so lucky. If there was a version of colonialism that you want to have, it's going to be the Guam model. But the reality is that's just not the case. We suffer a lot of economic complications and difficulties. And clearly, when it comes to federal funding, we as territories are funded roughly, depending on the year, of course, and the Congress and how they're feeling at that time. One calculation of the GAO, which is the General Accounting Office of the U.S. Congress, indicated that we receive about 1/7 of funding that is afforded to U.S. states. So it's really a fraction. We're excluded for a number of different standard U.S. social programs. For example, unemployment insurance is one that we're not able to participate in for whatever reason. And they have prohibitive federal territorial policies that really bind our hands in terms of economic development, one of which is called the Jones Act, which regulates which ships we're able to purchase goods from and how they come into our islands. And so when we look at what global wars has meant for CHamoru's, it's not been very good things. Clearly, we've experienced war occupation during World War II in the name of the United States flag. And we continue in very subtle and not so subtle ways, continue to be a threat, grave threat, and our environment and our land is clearly exploited. And so when we look at militarism and its legacy that it leaves for Guam, we have a history of radiation exposure, and this comes from the downwinds that were brought to the islands or that came to the islands as a result of the atomic testing in the Marshall Islands during the time of atomic testing. As well, we host, and I hate to use the word host, 1/3 of the island is occupied by the US Department of Defense. They control 1/3 of the island. And so clearly there's huge military bases in terms of, proportion to the size of the island. And because where there's military bases, there's toxic contamination that just goes hand in hand, especially from the toxic weaponry and war games that they play. And so this toxicity absorbs into our soil, it's in our water system, is also carried by the wind in the air. And so, and in the case of radiation, it's in the rain. And so when the rain falls, it goes into the soil and it just continues to perpetuate the toxicity. And of course, that also goes into the ocean, which affects the fish. And so we consume the fish, we consume vegetation, and then it also results in then poor health outcomes of our bodies. Part of militarism's legacy as well has been the prohibition of traditional practices, such as our traditional fishing practices. There's certain waters that we're not allowed to access, which has been very severing, as well as the prohibition of our language, which really occurred more so before World War II, as well as immediately after. We've experienced land dispossession. I shared earlier that 1/3 of the island is occupied by the Department of Defense, but those percentages have fluctuated, with the highest being immediately after World War II, when our people were concentrated. You can call them concentration camps, and the island was surveyed, and they took the prime real estate essentially for their purposes. That's the 1/3 that they consumed. We have a segregated school system where the U.S. Department of Defense has their own elementary, middle, and high schools. And ultimately is the deferment of Chamorro's rights to political self-determination. And while this happens in that we are a colony and we need to exercise our right, it is much more amplified in current times where we are at grave risk for attack. Be it from North Korea or from China, and now, with all of the heat that's gone up in terms of the Middle East, because our island bears so much fortification in terms of military resources, we become a very big target for attack. I just wanted to share real briefly this slide, which is of the Bravo detonation in 1954 of Bikini Island. And so as you can see, there's a radius there of radiation exposure with Guåhan off to the left, and you have Bikini in the middle. Essentially what's happened, even though it's quite a distance, the winds blow downwind from these islands, which include Bikini, as well as Rongelap and Enewetak. And so we are in direct downwinds. And so there's verification and there's evidence that indicate and clear that there's no question anymore in terms of the island's exposure, particularly during those years of these major testings of nuclear weapons. So we've been exposed there as well. And so, disparities of health are indicated in various ways. One particular study, albeit old, it's an old study, it was done in 1997, but they were the first to be able to start to look at the military presence on our island and the impact that it has on our health. And so in this study, the authors stated that they reviewed a 25-year period from 1971 to 1995, and they stated that the incidence of cancer on Guam is high and that it may be increasing. Both male and female Chamorros appear to have had significantly higher rates of cancer than any other ethnic group on the island. And the findings reveal that the villages of Jigo and Santa Rita had the highest incidence rates. And this is actually in green because it's highlighted because those two particular villages are the ones where with the largest U.S. military bases and activities. And so when you have that kind of exposure to these toxins, then you're going to see high cancer rates. And so this slide shows and juxtaposes the rates of Chamorros, right, which is this aqua bar, and then you have the US rate for these different kinds of cancer, which is the green bar. So you can see major overrepresentation on a whole bunch of different types of cancer where we're at greatest risk. And so these numbers here are cases per 100,000 when they're age adjusted to the 2000 US standard population. And so that included rates for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, nasopharynx, breast, thyroid, stomach, liver, lung, and bronchus. And so what we do know is that we in the territories, and I say we in the territories because this slide here is taken from an article that was written in the Washington Post quite a bit of time ago, but it still very much rings true. And the author of this article stated, and I'll quote here, the key factor they agree is the island's unique status in American history. People here grow up with war ringing in their ears as described by their grandparents. Guam, a U.S. possession since it was taken in 1898 from the Spanish, is the only American soil with a sizable population to have been occupied by a foreign military power. This idea that we grow up with war ringing in our ears holds so true. And part of that experience includes high enlistment rates of our young men in particular. And when you have high enlistment rates, you're also going to have high rates of death. And so, what they did in this article is they computed the per 1,000, I'm sorry, per 100,000 rate of deaths and in US wars. And so as you can see here, the Guam rate is 5.8 per 100,000 population. And that is in contrast to the US rate of 1.44 per 100,000. And as you can see there, the other locations as well with trailing far behind Guåhan. Now, in this slide, the computation was done for Guåhan, but to be fair, other US territories also have very high enlistment rates. And you see this in the case in American Samoa. You see this sometimes in Puerto Rico. You see this as well in the freely associated states throughout Micronesia, which include the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. So we all suffer this kind of calamity. And so, of course, it raises the question, why? Why then are your youth joining the military and then dying at these alarming rates? And it's largely because of the economic constrictions of our economies because of our political status in our case. And so we have constant threats, right? We're always needing to quote unquote be ready for war and deployment. One morning I woke up, my son was in high school, and the newspaper headline said 14 minutes. You see it right there. And that was the amount of time that it would take for a missile to get from North Korea to Guam. The country of China, and I'm not trying to demonize China because I know the US has really engaged a very unfair kind of relationship with them, but there is a bomb that is called the Guam killer. And so we have high levels of community anxiety, not only because of the threats that are current, right? And now we have what's happening in the Middle East and so forth, but also because of the history of war experience that is still very much a part of our intergenerational trauma that exists here. And so part of military buildup includes cultural artifacts and historical sites being destroyed, and these are just some of those. As well as, we have the Hodson Lagu tree that's endangered, and, they're destroying these groves in order to be able to build military bases. And so that's just a little snippet. I hope that gives you some context in terms of our experience here in Guåhan. And that's all I have for you. Sizu Usmasi.
Well, yeah, firstly, I just want to thank again Lisa for her time and for sharing her knowledge and experiences with us, the struggle for self-determination in Guam, and indeed, the struggle for self-determination of Indigenous people across the Pacific is on, the front lines against the American and Australian imperialism that's plunging this region potentially into a very devastating nuclear war. So I think I'd speak for everyone in this room when I say, we stand in full solidarity with your struggle. So people may have seen a few months ago that the Trump administration released a so-called national security and national defense strategy, which are basically documents which sort of set out the kind of agenda of the US empire over the next few years. And in it, they call the Asia Pacific the key economic and geopolitical battleground of this century, which, as they say, is because it already accounts for half of the world's trade, and over the next few decades is expected to grow even larger. And the major anxiety for Trump's administration is that China will be able to outperform America economically in the coming years, and then they'll be able to use that economic power to assert themselves more and more across the region. And what that would basically mean is being able to do all the things that the Americans have always done, right? You know, threatening sanctions and tariffs on rival nations, as well as controlling major trade routes and all the rest of that. How they phrase it is that they want an Indo-Pacific that is free and open and without the singular domination of any one of their rivals. But the reality is that America, with the enthusiastic support of Australia, currently dominates the region. You know, they have over 400 military bases spread across the Indo-Pacific, and, you know, they station in those bases a total of around 300,000 troops, right? And alongside this, they have an arsenal of nuclear-armed warships, bombers, submarines, each of which could fire nuclear missiles that are each 80 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So if a war were to break out between America and China, it would very likely be more devastating than any other previous war in human history, and it could potentially threaten the entire planet. You know, and there's no doubt that Australia would be deeply involved in this war, as well as being a major target for those bombs. You know, we're a crucial part of the war plans against China, and we have been integrating ourselves into the US empire more deeply than ever before. Australia is essentially one of the most important bases that the Americans have in the region. We host essential communications hubs like Pine Gap. We have airstrips like Tyndall for the American military. But there can be a lot of confusion about why this is, right? One argument that we hear a lot is that Australia supports the American military because it is a lapdog for the Americans. That's basically forced into it by the much more powerful American state. So the main argument that I want to make in this introductory talk is that Australia should actually be understood as an imperialist force in its own right, which is independently pursuing its own regional interests, and which it sees as being best served by integrating themselves as closely as possible into the US alliance. And I think it's very important that the anti-war movement here understands this, because understanding it means pointing the finger squarely for all the horrors and all the atrocities of the American world order, not just at Trump, but also at Albanese. And importantly, it's Albanese's war plans and regional ambitions that the working class here has the power to actually shut down, right? So, but before we go any further, I just want to give a very quick definition of imperialism, because there's a lot of different ones that go around the left. So what we mean by imperialism starts from the understanding that the most important role of a capitalist state is to make sure that their economies, and more specifically, the biggest businesses inside those economies, are able to keep making profits. So they have to do things like provide, you know, education systems to train workers, healthcare to keep them alive, all the rest of it. Since capitalism is a global system, this also means ensuring things like trade are stable and as stacked in their favor as they possibly can be. But because every capitalist state on the globe is trying to do this, this leads to a system of international competition, which is essentially based on military power. And it's this power which ultimately determines whether, you know, sea lanes can be kept open, or whether sanctions can force a country into accepting, you know, whatever kind of deal. So, you know, important to this understanding is that we can see that imperialism isn't just one block of oppressive nations, you know, which would mean that anyone that is, you know, against that block is an anti-imperialist nation. Actually, you know, it's an inherent product of competition in the capitalist system that have to compete on a global market. You know, they're all vying to fight their way up the pecking order, right? And I think this understanding of imperialism helps us to see that while Australia may not be as powerful as other countries, it's still independently competing for as much of a leg up as it can get. This is because Australia has its own economy that it needs to serve, you know, for instance, by maintaining access to maritime trade. So maritime trade in Australia, for instance, accounts for over 99% of our $500 billion in trade every single year. And over 90% of that trade passes through just 3 straits in Indonesia, right? And in fact, Australia is so reliant on this shipping that we've been particularly affected by Iran's closing of Hormuz, right? Our gas prices have spiked up 40%, which is 10% more than any other country in the OECD. And it's actually the 4th worst price increase in the entire world, behind only Malaysia, the Philippines, and Myanmar, right? So it's very clearly important for the Australian state to keep those shipping lanes open, but it's also very unlikely that we'll be able to do that on our own, right? Australia just isn't powerful enough. So to compensate for this, the Australian state has always sought to keep a very close alliance with a global superpower, which gives Australia a leverage in the region that it wouldn't otherwise have. This means that the problem for the Australian government is usually not that they're being forced into American wars or military deals or all that sort, but actually that there's too little interest or too little attention being paid to Australia by their big power backer. You know, this means that governments, both Labor, Australian governments, both Labor and Liberal, are clamoring all the time for more American troops in the region, not less. You know, this is why the AUKUS deal was not forced on us by the US. It was actually pushed for by Australian ministers, right? We had an earlier session at our conference which dealt with AUKUS in more detail, so I'll just give some spark notes now. But AUKUS is a military alliance between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It was set up by the Morrison Liberal government, but it was very enthusiastically embraced by the Albanese Labor government when they came in. And its centerpiece is the Australian government spending over $368 billion on acquiring a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. And the point of those submarines is that they can stay submerged for months at a time, meaning they can conduct long-range expeditions off our shores and around China. The submarines, as a Liberal minister at the time let slip, are about force projection, which is really just code for being intended to wage offensive wars, right? But the AUKUS deal isn't just about submarines, right? It's about deepening Australia's integration into the American military machine across the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS is the reason that there were 3 Australian soldiers that were crewing the American nuclear submarine that sunk the Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka, killing at least 87 people. And another part of AUKUS is expanding the US military presence in Australia. Already, there are thousands of US Marines that are deployed to Darwin every single year on a 6-monthly rotation. And nearby in Darwin, we're expanding the Tyndall Air Base so that can host up to 6 of the US's B-52 bombers, each of which could hold 20 nukes and deliver that sort of crisis. So alongside this, Labor is spending billions of dollars developing a domestic weapons production capacity, giving out lucrative contracts to American arms companies to start manufacturing missiles in Australia. But most importantly, Australia hosts the Pine Gap spy base near Alice Springs. And Pine Gap's 45 satellite dishes collect and process data gathered by US satellites above the Middle East, above Asia, and above the Pacific. It's jointly run by the US government and the Australian government in almost complete secrecy. It's illegal to even take photos of the base. So what we do know has come mostly from leaked documents. And what those documents have shown is that it plays an absolutely critical role in the US military machine, right? Able to do things like spy and tap into people's phones and then geolocate those phones to target them for missile strikes, right? So, yes. Okay. So, and all this money that's being spent on AUKUS and building up this military capacity, it should be getting spent on things like public housing and properly funding our health and education system. So to give some sense of scale, we're just about half of the military spending that's going towards AUKUS. We could actually provide an entire home for every single homeless person that currently is in Australia, right? But instead, public institutions like our universities being scrapped for parts to prepare for a potentially apocalyptic war against China. So the main point is that AUKUS is not, just for Australia to get a submarine fleet. The main point is for it to be able Australia to demonstrate their strategic relevance to the Americans, and in doing so, they hope that the Americans will repay them by backing us up when we pursue our own interests in the region. But this also doesn't mean that Australia just sits around and waits for American approval before it can take matters into its own hands. So Timor-Leste is a good example of this. When Portugal withdrew from the country in 1974, Australia was terrified of a little Cuba off the coast of Australia. So they supported Suharto's brutal authoritarian regime in Indonesia to carry out a genocide of the Timorese and occupy the Strip. The Whitlam government also figured it would be easier to negotiate splitting up its huge gas reserves that were controlled by Indonesia than if it were an independent country. So we trained officers, we supplied weapons, which would then be used to strafe and massacre entire villages, ultimately wiping out a full 1/8 of the population over 25 years of occupation. The Australian government wasn't forced into doing any of that by the Americans. In fact, the Americans gave it a nod, but asked for Indonesia to keep them and their equipment out of it. And after the 1991 Dili massacre, which exposed to the world the horrors of the Indonesian occupation, the US restricted their arms sales. Australia kept them up, becoming the major arms supplier for Indonesia while they were carrying out that genocide. And when Suharto was eventually overthrown and Timor-Leste gained its independence, Howard, the Australian Prime Minister, led a UN peacekeeping mission into the country, peacekeeping, which effectively allowed the Australians to hold the gas reserves of Timor-Leste hostage, threatening to withdraw aid if they weren't going to give them a good deal, right? And when all was said and done, Australia effectively decimated Timor-Leste, facilitated a genocide, stole its natural resources, and it now remains one of the poorest countries in the world. And to rub salt in the wound, Australia is currently negotiating with Timor-Leste to allow Santos to pump its carbon capture, what they hope will be carbon capture, back into the empty gas fields that we stole and emptied from Timor-Leste, right? So this is why Tom and Lincoln, I think, is quite right to call Australia a neighbour from hell. You know, we have our own imperial project in the region, and where Australia feels it's strong enough, like against Timor-Leste, you know, it's able to dominate on its own. But more broadly, it needs that American backing. But I think the core thing for us, the crucial thing for us, is that what this means is that as they entrench themselves deeper and deeper into the US alliance, all of those atrocities that we're seeing across the world, whether it's the genocide in Gaza, whether it's the carpet bombing of Iran, our government is playing a very, very active role in carrying that out, you know. And unfortunately, I don't think this has become a common sense in the Palestine movement, you know, which means I don't think the Palestine movement has actually translated into a much broader anti-war and anti-imperialist movement that's able to squarely pin the blame on Albanese and has something to say actually about what we as Australian workers and activists can do here to actually halt the war machine and stop the genocide in Gaza, and more broadly, prevent an anti-imperialist war between the US and China, which would very likely, you know, devastate the entire planet. So I'll just wrap up with this. So at the peak of the anti-war movement a few decades ago against Vietnam, the moratorium marches pulled out hundreds of thousands of trade unionists and activists under the banner "Stop Work to Stop the War." And the movement forced the Liberal government at the time to commit to withdrawing all troops from Vietnam. You know, and its success helped to propel a whole decade of industrial and political radicalism. But behind that peak of the movement was a decade of groundwork, right? Winning those arguments in the trade unions, winning those arguments on the campuses, that the war was wrong, that working people could have a power and a role to play in stopping it. So I'll just finish on a basic point. If we're going to rebuild that sort of movement that can actually stop a war, we will need to be much more organized, and we'll need to have socialists in every corner of society that can carry out those arguments. And to do that, we need everyone in this room to get involved in solidarity. Thanks.